For the last few years I've been taking part in the Steampunks in Space event, which takes place at the National Space Centre in Leicester. I've taken my sculptures along for the last 4 or 5 years now. However, this year they ran an exhibition entitled the Space Race Exhibition, and they were looking for artists to create space-themed steampunk sculptures. So I put a proposal forward and was commissioned to make a piece. So this is it. It's a steampunk astronaut. Now, I've been doing steampunk for about 8 years now, so I've got plenty of steampunk items sitting in boxes in the workshop. So I figured I could use some of the costumes and pieces that I'd made previously to deck out a mannequin. All I would need to do is actually make a head for the mannequin, and that would basically allow me to make an entire life-size figure. So that's the proposal I put forward, and this is the finished result. So this is a silicone head which is attached to a shop mannequin, and that's been dressed with an overall and various steampunk pieces that I've made in the past. I'm very pleased with the way this has come out. I think it looks really realistic, and I like the sculpture and just the overall look of it. So I'm going to go through how I made this in the video. But of course, as with many things, it began with a sculpture. So like I said, what I did was to buy a shop mannequin. This is just something I got off eBay, and I figured I could sculpt over this and cover the rest of the body in costume and steampunk items that I'd made previously. So what I've done is to put some Chavant oil clay into the oven, just at about 50 or 60 degrees. That allows the Chavant to soften and makes it much more easy to work with. So at the minute I'm just blocking out the sculpture and getting the basic shapes in place. This would be a bit laborious if the clay was still hard, so having it nice and soft from the oven is really helpful. So in the initial stages of this, I'm just blocking out the basic shapes of the face. I'm also using a set of calipers just to make sure that this is more or less proportioned correctly. It needs to be slightly bigger than a real head because obviously the mannequin head underneath needs to be covered by the clay. So although this is large, I kind of figured that there are people who are bigger than me. I mean, this mannequin head's about the same size as my head, and there are people who are bigger than me and have a larger head, so I figured I could get away with that. Nevertheless, I'm using myself for reference here, so not in the final look of it, but just for the measurements of the proportions. So, you know, I know my head's about 24 centimeters tall, for example. So I was using those measures to make sure that I got the sculpture more or less in the right area. When I'm initially blocking out a sculpture like this, I do tend to spend quite a lot of time just trying to get the look of it correct, and that's just the basic proportions. So if the proportions are off, then it's going to make the sculpture look wrong no matter what you do to it. So it's quite important at the beginning of this, just to make sure everything is correctly proportioned and placed so it doesn't look unnatural. Now I already had a basic idea of how this should look. I wanted him to be a Victorian adventurer, effectively. I kind of figured if there was a steampunk space academy or organisation, then it would probably be the sort of people who would have gone off on safari in Africa, and I sort of figured that that would mostly be rich people. So he's going to be a bit overweight, a bit sort of red in the face, a bit blustery, and I was thinking the look on his face could be based upon General Melchett from Blackadder Goes Forth. Here's a picture if you're not familiar. I just always liked that character as being a sort of a stereotypical British colonial military guy who sort of isn't particularly forward thinking and, you know, is very set in his ways. So I figured he would probably be a similar type of guy and would have a sort of similar expression. So I want him to sort of have that big protruding lower lip and a sort of scrunched up face as though he's sort of staring at someone in indignation. Now I've got to a stage here where I need to put some eyes in, and these are eyes that my fiancée actually had for her university course. She did a special effects course at university, so she gave me all of the bits from her course when we moved in together. Amongst all of the various tools and things that she had was these eyes, and she actually got these made at Moorfields Eye Hospital by people who actually make prosthetics, so they're the genuine article, I think, and they do look really, really nice. So I wanted to incorporate these into the sculpture. Because there's a mannequin underneath the clay, I didn't actually have enough space to use some of the other fake eyes I've got, like these ones. Because they're round, there just simply wasn't enough space in the sculpture for them to fit. Now I did think that I could maybe cut a hole in the back of the mannequin's head and then cut some spaces in there for the eyes, but given that the ones that my fiancée had were half spheres, I figured that they would work better. And for quite a long time while I was doing this, I did actually think, well, maybe I'll replace them with these other ones later in the day, but they just look right, so I decided to stick with them. So as you can see at this stage, it's sort of looking like something. I'm happy with the basic proportions and the expression on the face. I think it still maybe needs a little bit more refinement, but it's certainly in the right area. So I'm just blocking out the ear here, and given that he's going to be a bit of an older chap, I figured his ears would actually be quite large, so I'm making them a little bit larger than you might normally. I wanted to give a little bit more work to the lips. I wanted to have that look as though he's scrunching his mouth up and sort of sticking his lower lip out in sort of an indignant way. So I figured his upper lip would probably be a bit squished, so I'm trying to sort of sculpt that in. Now I think on the final version he's probably going to have a giant handlebar moustache, so it's quite possible that a lot of this detail won't end up being seen. Nevertheless, I want to just get this as realistic as I can, so I think it's right to sculpt the understructure anyway, even though if it's not going to be immediately visible in the final piece. Now a lot of expression is actually conveyed by the forehead as well. If you're sort of frowning or screaming or something like that, your forehead will scrunch up. So I'm just trying to get the folds of skin in correctly there on the forehead. Okay, so as you can see, I've now got into a position where the sculpture's looking fairly complete. So I'm now working on some of the smaller details on the eyes. Now these things that you can see me using are actually silicone brushes, so that's a sculpting tool with a soft head to it. And I find these quite useful because they're quite good for smoothing out details, and I found myself using them quite a lot. Now I haven't done many sculptures that are actually one-to-one scale, like life-size scale. So what I do, of course, add in texture to sculptures that I've made previously. I've rarely had to do actual skin texture because for smaller scale models, you just won't see that detail. So I actually referred to some videos online to find out exactly how to do this. And this one in particular was quite useful, so I'll put a link in the description if you're interested. But I found this really good. I think this chap does prosthetic makeup, so he had some techniques in here which were really interesting. So you can see here what I've been doing is digging out some individual pores across the cheek and then smoothing them out with a silicone brush, so now extending that across the rest of the face as well. Now when I initially did this, I found that I'd actually gone a little bit too heavy, so you can see I'm cutting in all of these small indentations across the face. What I found was though that you really need to pay attention as to how skin textures. So in some areas, for example around the nose, you might get quite large pores, but on the cheeks and lower down towards the chin, the pores might be smaller. So I didn't get it quite right here. I went for sort of large pores all the way across, and he sort of ended up looking a little bit like a lizard. So I had to sort of scale it back slightly after a while. I also found the silicone tools quite useful for putting in smooth wrinkle detail on the eyes. And this is something else. I'd heard about doing this before, but I never really tried it, and that is to sculpt through some plastic. The plastic sheeting has the effect of softening the tool marks that you make, so that can allow you to get some quite natural and smooth wrinkles and lines. Then I'm just further smoothing that out with the silicone tool. So now turning my attention to the chin and the lips. I'm just trying to sculpt in here a variety of pore detail and wrinkled skin. Now, although I mentioned I thought I'd gone a little bit too strong here with the texturing on the face, one thing to remember when you're doing this is that when you come to make your mould and then cast this sculpture up in silicone, although the sculpture detail looks quite heavy because the Chavant is opaque, when you cast it up in silicone, the silicone is going to be a little bit translucent, so the individual details that you're sculpting here won't be quite as obvious in the final piece. So although I did ultimately try and soften down some of this texture detail, I didn't go too far because I knew that it wouldn't stand out quite as much in the final cast piece. So So I actually found myself using a variety of techniques here. Using a thinner to smooth down the clay with a paintbrush was one, sculpting through a piece of plastic to create some slightly softer lines was another, and as I've said, I also found myself using silicone brushes quite a lot to smooth out sharp edges on the detail and to get a more natural, realistic look to the skin texture that I'm putting in. So the nose is somewhere where you do expect quite large pores, so I'm using a large sewing needle in a vice grip here, and I'm just putting in some pore detail through a piece of plastic. I found that worked quite well. As you can also see here, I'm smoothing it down slightly with a brush and some white spirit as well. I went back and forth over the wrinkles under the eyes quite a lot as well, so you can see how I'm sculpting those in using some plastic again, and also using some white spirit as well to smooth out the clay. As I mentioned, I found that I'd gone a little bit too heavy with some of the texture detail here, so as you can see here, I'm actually going in with a small loop tool and creating some very fine wrinkles and things like that. Although there are some large scale skin details in sculpture, I think it's also important to have the smaller ones in there. It does give that sense of scale, and I found that it added a sense of realism to it as I went. Obviously you can see quite a lot of clay balling up here as I sculpt, so I ultimately smoothed all this down with some thinner. I've seen other people actually freeze these pieces with some spray and then brush it off. I've not tried that, but I have found that the smoothing it down with the thinner works very well. So there's just some close-up detail of some of the texture that I've done on this. Now, like I said, this is the first time I've really done a one-to-one scale sculpture, so this is a bit of a learning process for me, but I'm quite pleased with how this has come out. I think it looks pretty natural. It's probably not quite as good as some of the texture I've seen in the video that I was using for reference, but for a first attempt I think I'm quite happy with that. Now, one other thing that I saw in the video which I thought was really cool was a way to create goosebumps, so like raised areas of skin. So what the guy was doing was to stick a needle in, lift up some clay, and then what he would get was a scrim of clay, and what that is some clay that's been mixed up with a thinner to make it into a paste. He was then brushing that over the indentations that he'd cut. That would fill in the hole, and once you brushed it all away, it leaves you with some raised areas that look quite convincingly like goosebumps. So I was quite impressed with that, and I thought it was a really good way of creating some raised areas without going to the laborious process of sculpting them all up. So that was really cool too. So I used that quite a lot on the neck, which is sort of where you're going to get that type of skin. So there's my completed sculpture. As you can see, it only covers the front half of the mannequin. The idea being that there's going to be costume covering the back of the head and the back of the neck, so I only need the front. I'm quite pleased with how this has come out. Obviously I've gone into a lot of detail about how I've done the texture on the sculpture, and I think that looks quite cool. I also paid a lot of attention to his expression. I wanted him to be quite expressive, and I've sort of made him perhaps slightly caricature. I mean, maybe his features are slightly exaggerated. That's because I wanted that expression to read when people looked at it, so I think that's come out quite well. I often find that a lot of my sculptures are a little bit inexpressive, so I made a real effort to make sure this guy had a look to him, that he had a bit of character. So that's it for this part of the video. In the next part of the video I'm going to be looking at making a mould of this chap and then casting him up in dragon skin silicone, which is the type of silicone from Smooth On. So that's it for the time being. Thanks very much for watching. I hope this has proved useful in some way, and I'll see you next time. Thanks very much for watching. I'll be posting more videos on this project and others, so if you'd like to keep up with what's going on, please do subscribe. Alternatively, you can visit my website, which is www.thedarkpower.com, or you can find me on Facebook, just search for The Dark Power.